All right, we'll begin. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Carson Holloway. I'm the department chair for the Department of Political Science. So I'd like to do the following things as we begin. I'll introduce the lecture series. I'll introduce our lecturer. And then this is a special version of this event because we'll have a panel discussion after the lecture to continue our education in James Madison. And so after we have the lecture proper, I'll then introduce the rest of the panelists. So yeah, this is a very special version of the Kent A. Kirwan lecture in the history of political philosophy. The Kirwan lecture series is named after Professor Kent Kirwan, who was a long-serving and beloved member of the political science department and chair of the department at one time. And he taught for us political philosophy, the history of political philosophy, and also American constitutional law. And the lecture series is named in his honor and focuses on the things that he loved to teach and that the students loved to learn from him. And so I should also mention that Mrs. Kirwan is here, and we're very grateful to have her here and grateful for the Kirwan family's support for the lecture series. This is also a special one because it's sort of re-inaugurating the lecture series. We were not able to do it for obvious reasons relating to an ailment that I will not name because we've heard it so many times for the last couple of years. And it's special for that reason. It's special because we're also adding the panel. The Kirwan lecture itself is funded by the Kirwan Lecture Fund, which is held by the Nebraska Foundation. But we also have a lecture series this year called the Constitutional Studies Forum, which is supporting the panel that's going to happen afterwards. So that's the Jack Miller Center's support. And again, the sponsorship of the Political Science Department. So we're grateful for all of that help. I was also looking over the records of the history of the lecture series, and I was reminded that this is the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the series. And the first lecturer 10 years ago was a person of eminent accomplishments and a familiar name. It was Catherine Zuckert, who spoke to us about Plato. And now Michael's going to talk to us about James Madison today. So let me introduce our speaker. Michael Zuckert is the Nancy Drew Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He works in two fields of political theory and constitutional studies, which is a great fit for this lecture series in Kent's honor, in both of which he has published extensively. He has published Natural Rights and the New Republicanism, The Natural Rights Republic, and Launching Liberalism. These are all excellent books. And with Catherine Zuckert, The Truth About Leo Strauss, in addition to many articles. He has edited with Derek Webb the anti-federal writings of the Melanchthon Smith Circle, and he has a book, Leo Strauss and the Problem of Political Philosophy, also with Catherine Zuckert, which was published a few years ago by the University of Chicago Press, and is working on Natural Rights and the New Constitutionalism, a study of American constitutionalism in a theoretical context. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you're working a book on Lincoln too, is that correct?
Yeah.
A lot of great stuff coming out. All right, so without further ado, let's welcome our guest speaker, Michael Zuckert.
Thank you very much. I should say it's an honor to be the Kent Kirwan speaker. I knew Kent Kirwan not really well. We overlapped in graduate school. He was a couple of years older than me, and I think he was already writing his dissertation when I arrived there, but he was one of those advanced students for whom we younger people had tremendous respect and kind of looked at with a kind of awe. So it's a privilege to be here in his name. So my topic today is, well, I call it the consistency of James Madison, but I'm particularly concerned with one aspect of his work, which is the Bill of Rights, and I'll explain what his connection to the Bill of Rights was as I move on. But I want to start with the Bill of Rights itself. This, according to polls of the American people, is the most beloved and valued part of the Constitution. And given that fact, it may perhaps surprise people to know that the Bill of Rights almost did not make it into the Constitution. But on September 17th, 1787, the date we think of as Constitution Day, on that date, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention signed the Constitution, and it contained no Bill of Rights at that time. Question has arisen over time why that was so, that people have speculated about that for many years. The simplest explanation, I think, for an absence of a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution is that delegates just ran out of time. They had been working, this was September, mid-September, they had been working since mid-May, quite a long time, during a very hot Philadelphia summer when the windows of Independence Hall had been boarded up so as to prevent passersby from eavesdropping on their proceedings. When we think about their accomplishments that summer, making this amazing Constitution, we should appreciate, I think, how much they sweated on behalf of their countrymen and their posterity. So a few days before they were to adjourn, however, one of the delegates said, I paraphrase, wait, we've forgotten to add a Bill of Rights. And when put to a vote, the idea of staying on to prepare a Bill of Rights lost by a vote of 10 states to 0. Excuse me. Let's just say that they were eager to get home and take a shower. But during the efforts to win approval of the draft Constitution in the 13 states, the absence of a Bill of Rights was raised as a major objection in the state ratifying conventions, as a major objection to the Constitution. Many supporters of the Constitution feared that this agitation for a Bill of Rights would sabotage the Constitution, either directly by leading to a vote against it, or indirectly by requiring a new convention before the draft would be approved, a new convention that would deadlock over the terms of the amendments, and therefore we'd end up with no new Constitution. So a compromise solution was worked out at this time, that the state conventions could ratify the convention's proposals for, and then would submit proposals for amendments that it was promised would be considered promptly when the new government started up. And this, I think, was a good solution, a good compromise solution. However, when the new government got going, there was a lot of urgent business that needed attending to. They had to set up a revenue system, for example. They needed to establish the executive departments. They needed to establish the judiciary, among other things. I mean, very important, obviously very important things for the operation of the government. But about after a year, James Madison, attempted to turn the attention of Congress toward this promised Bill of Rights. Now, at this point, something strange occurred, even in a way more mysterious than the absence of a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. There was no push for an amendment when Madison raised this again in the Congress. Indeed, there was a good deal of resistance to turning in that direction. Now, since the Federalists, that is the party Madison was part of, the people who were promoting the Constitution, since the Federalists were not really enthused about a Bill of Rights, the lack of interest among them was not too surprising, except that they had tacitly promised to take up amendments promptly on the startup of the new government, but that by the side. But the Anti-Federalists had made a big deal about the absence of the amendments, but Anti-Federalists who now were serving in Congress did not cry out in favor of Madison's proposal to turn towards writing a Bill of Rights. So at this point, neither the Federalists nor the Anti-Federalists were eager to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. The only person who seemed at all eager was James Madison, and he had been opposed to a Bill of Rights during the ratification struggle, and afterward was at first lukewarm at best. As he wrote to his neighbor, Thomas Jefferson, he claimed, untruly turned out, to have favored a Bill of Rights always. But despite that, he told Jefferson that he never thought the omission of one a material defect. He added that he had not viewed a Bill of Rights in an important light. This letter to Jefferson was written almost exactly 1 year after the original Constitution Day this was written in October of 1788. About 8 months later, in June of 1789, Madison rose in Congress to advocate for amendments in Congress. At the moment he did that, he was about the only person in government who seemed actually to favor adding the Bill of Rights. Now, while this sort of hypothetical history is always risky, it does appear that if Madison had not been so persistent in presenting a Bill of Rights and advocating it as vigorously as he did, the Constitution might never have ended up containing a Bill of Rights, at least not at that time. So if not for James Madison, perhaps no Bill of Rights. Now, Madison's stance toward a Bill of Rights went through three phases, as I've suggested: opposition, lukewarmth, and advocacy. This first phase, the opposition phase, occupied the time during which the Constitution was being ratified, roughly from September of 1787, when they signed it, to June of 1788. He was most outspoken against amendments in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, to which he was a delegate, as well as he had been at the Constitutional Convention. He was quite emphatic at that convention. He said, "The Constitution in its present form is infinitely more safe than it would be after introducing into it that long train of alterations which its opponents call amendments." But on the issue of amendments, there were two complicating factors that had much to do with his stridently negative attitude towards them. First was the issue of timing. As I said before, one of the major themes of anti-federalist opposition to the Constitution was its lack of a Bill of Rights, a concern shared by many citizens who otherwise favored the Constitution. The anti-federalists, used these misgivings to press for amendments prior to ratification. That's one of the major agenda items for them. They wanted prior amendments. As Madison charged at the Virginia Convention, previous amendments are but another name for rejection. As Madison charged at the convention, he addressed these efforts at prior modification in one of the obscure Federalist papers that he wrote, Federalist number 38, which hardly anybody ever reads anymore. But the point of this essay was to face squarely the wide range of objections that had been raised against the draft Constitution and to discourage the movement in favor of prior amendments. Objectors, Madison pointed out, do not agree on what is objectionable in the Constitution, nor do they agree on what should be done to improve it. Given these disagreements, he insisted that he could, he said, never consent to previous amendments because they are pregnant with dreadful dangers. The demand for prior amendments would prevent ratification, he thought, because the immense disagreement among these critics would prevent consensus on modifications. So Madison's tactical sense told him that the true friends of the Constitution should give no countenance to prior amendments. Thus, he never spoke before ratification in favor of a Bill of Rights or any other amendments or changes to the Constitution. He explained this strategy very clearly to a neighbor of his, a different neighbor, not Jefferson. Here's what he said: "While the Constitution remained unratified and it was necessary to unite the states in some one plan, I opposed all previous alterations as calculated to throw the states into dangerous contentions and to furnish the secret enemies of the Union with an opportunity of promoting its dissolution. But," he went on, "circumstances are now changed. The Constitution is established. Amendments pursued with a proper moderation in the proper mode will be not only safe, but may serve the double purpose of satisfying the minds of well-meaning opponents and of providing additional grounds in favor of liberty." So Madison's early opposition to amendments had another basis as well as this timing issue. The absence of a Bill of Rights was surely one of the anti-federalists' chief targets in their opposition to the Constitution, but there were many other features of the constitutional proposal that they wished to see changed. Both they and Madison saw many of these other changes to be more important to the constitutional plan than a Bill of Rights. For example, the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention The first to ratify and attach recommended amendments called for many changes that eventually did become part of the Bill of Rights, but also they called for such structural changes as a prohibition on Congress laying direct taxes, creating monopolies, or regulating elections. As scholar Herbert Storing, a common teacher, by the way, of myself and of Kent Kirwan, as Herbert Storing summarized the matter, the Anti-Federalists wanted, I'm quoting him here, to revise the basic structure and powers of the new federal government. All the state ratifying conventions that proposed amendments included suggestions to strengthen the states and limit the powers of Congress relating to such crucial matters as federal elections, military affairs, and commercial regulation. Madison made clear, Storing goes on, that he had no intention of proposing or accepting any amendments along these lines. As it turned out, these dangerous amendments were not seriously considered because of the overwhelming Federalist majority in Congress. But in the early days of agitation for amendments, Madison had no way of knowing that the process would work in his favor to such a degree. He naturally feared that opening things up to amendments of a Bill of Rights sort could lead to amendments of the sort that he definitely did not want to see in the Constitution. So Madison's early hesitations about a Bill of Rights were thus connected to his concerns about other matters, about the constitutional structure as a whole. Ratification and maintenance of the fundamentally new federal structure embodied in the Constitution prevented him supporting changes of any sort. It's possible, in other words, that he did indeed always support a Bill of Rights, despite his interventions against one in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. So perhaps one could say Madison's lukewarm stage of support of the Bill of Rights overlapped with his period of opposition. I want to turn to that lukewarm stage now. The best expression of his lukewarmness came in his letter to Thomas Jefferson of October 1788. This was about a half a year after the Constitution achieved ratification. This letter was one in a series of exchanges between Madison and Jefferson, partly on the Bill of Rights. Jefferson had been a strong advocate, always was a strong advocate for a Bill of Rights. He said in an earlier letter to Madison, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, and no just government should refuse or rest one on inference." In his response to this, Madison claimed both to favor a Bill of Rights and not to consider its absence to be important. It was the latter that received most of his attention. A Bill of Rights, he thought, if properly executed, he said, could not be a disservice. However, he thought it could be improperly constructed and do harm. There were two commonly mentioned dangers that a badly drawn up Bill of Rights could bring about. The Constitution, as drafted, provided for a limited set of enumerated powers to be exercised by the federal government. Powers not granted were, to coin a phrase, not granted, and therefore not to be exercised. So consider a Bill of Rights provisions such as in our First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Okay, that's in the First Amendment. First off, many Federalists insisted this is unnecessary because Congress has not been granted power to abridge or otherwise intrude upon the freedom of speech. So there's no need to prohibit it from doing so. And worse than the superfluity that this objection points to is this thought: might not the prohibition of a power not delegated to Congress be taken to imply that there are powers beyond those listed in the Constitution and open up, in principle, an unlimited array of implied powers? Thus, if a limited grant of powers to the federal government is a protection for liberty, isn't a prohibition of ungranted powers a danger to liberty? This is no doubt an irony, but it was one that Madison and other Federalists feared. There was also a very parallel danger with respect to rights. Let us consider another aspect of the First Amendment. Congress shall not prohibit the free exercise of religion. That's provided there. This Bill of Rights provision singles out a particular right, the right of free exercise of religion, for explicit protection. Does this not imply that rights not expressly identified in the constitutional text have no claims to protection? Are there not rights that government ought not to interfere with, but which are too numerous to enumerate? What about the right to walk on the side of the road that one prefers? What about the right to save your money under your mattress or in a bank as it suits your fancy? Or the right to wear a hat of a style you find attractive? Are these things merely fair game for government intrusion? Bills of rights, it was thought, can be dangerous by implying a government has power it does not have, that is, by implying powers, or by denying that there are implied rights not identified explicitly, that is, by denying implied rights. Now, Madison saw these two things as dangers, but he did not fear them quite as much as many others did, for he saw ways to draw up amendments so that the dangers could be avoided. His solution was ingenious: to include two additional amendments that would head off, in principle at least, these fearful consequences of a Bill of Rights. The first is what became the Ninth Amendment, which reads as follows, and it's a mouthful, so listen. The enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That is to say, the explicit identification and protection of certain rights is not to be taken to imply that other unmentioned rights do not exist or deserve protection. The second solution is the 10th Amendment, which reads, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, which is to say that the protection of certain rights in a Bill of Rights is not to be taken to imply that absent that the explicit protection, Congress has some sort of implied powers to otherwise abridge that right or legislate where there is no actually granted power. So Madison was able to draw the potential poison of a Bill of Rights, but even so, during his lukewarm phase, he was not an enthusiastic supporter. His main reservation was that a Bill of Rights would contribute little to securing the rights of his countrymen. He found that the Constitution contained plenteous instruments for the protection of liberty more effective than a Bill of Rights would be. So, for example, he saw some rights protecting power in the manner in which the federal powers are granted. That is to say, the powers of the US government, as we've seen, are enumerated and limited. For the most part, they do not touch topics like the exercise of religion, topics like that, which were of great concern to supporters of the Bill of Rights. This argument had been famously made by Representative James Wilson of Pennsylvania, one of Madison's chief allies at the Constitutional Convention. Madison gave Wilson's argument some weight, but he was quick to insist that he did not accept it entirely. As he said in his later congressional speech on the Bill of Rights, this argument, he says, is not conclusive to the extent which has been supposed. It is true, he said, the powers of the general government are limited, but even if government keeps within those limits, it has certain discretionary powers with respect to the means which may admit of abuse. So, although the powers are enumerated, it might well happen that in existing and exercising one of these enumerated powers, the legislature could choose means that impinge on a fundamental right that deserves protection. It was one common example at the time. Congress has the power to tax. We're all familiar with that one. Might it not be possible for it to exercise this power in such a way as to abridge the freedom of the press? Tax newspapers, for example, at a prohibitive rate. An explicit prohibition would then indeed add something to the limitations imposed by the enumerated powers. The enumerated character of the powers provides some protection for rights, but not complete protection. More effective in protecting rights, Madison thought, is the dual structure of the new constitutional system. The combination of limited enumerated powers allotted to Congress, along with, as he put it, the jealousy of the state governments. These together afford a security which has not existed in the case of the state governments alone and exists in no other, the two come to get in combination. Madison, in general, put far more trust in institutional or structural features than in what he liked to call parchment barriers. The tensions between the general government and the states, with the latter's incentives to resist any efforts by the general government to overstep its boundaries and abridge the rights of citizens, will supply better protection for rights than any long list of prohibitions on governmental action. Okay. Now, all the points that I have mentioned so far were more or less standard parts of the debates over the Bill of Rights. More interesting, however, was an approach to the question that was unique to Madison, the implications of which, when he thought them through, led into his third phase of enthusiastic support for adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. That enthusiasm was especially significant, for without it, as we've noticed, perhaps we would not have had a Bill of Rights. His unique theme remained the general inefficacy of a Bill of Rights, but the analysis shifted to a more theoretical basis. Experience, he told Jefferson, proves the inefficacy of a Bill of Rights on those occasions when its control is most needed. Repeated violations of these parchment barriers have been committed by overbearing majorities in every state. In raising this consideration, Madison revealed how differently he was thinking about a Bill of Rights from Jefferson and others of his fellows. The idea of a Bill of Rights, he pointed out, is a legacy to the Americans from their English heritage, according to which the reserved rights were intended as checks against the monarch. In that case, the Bill of Rights can have an effect because, as Madison put it, in a monarchy, the latent force of the nation is superior to that of the sovereign, and a solemn charter of popular rights must have a great effect as a standard for rousing and uniting the superior force of the community. But the Americans had not founded a monarchy. The political dynamics, he thought, were completely different in a republic than in a monarchy. Now, of course, the Anti-Federalists and Jefferson and others who were seeking a Bill of Rights were aware that the Constitution established a republic, but they continued to think of the danger to popular rights on a model of a monarch ruling the people. In the case of the American situation, these fearful Americans tended to believe that the danger to rights was to come from, as Madison put it, acts of government contrary to the sense of its constituents. Because the governors are not kept on a short enough leash, Anti-Federalists believed that there was a constant danger that the governments would altogether slip their leash and become oppressors of the people. Madison doubted that even under this scenario, a Bill of Rights would do much good. More than parchment was needed. Some device with teeth was necessary to provide an effective check. Now here, on this very point, Jefferson made a real contribution to Madison's thinking, one that I think we'll recognize. A Bill of Rights can acquire efficacy, said Jefferson, through the legal check which it puts into the hands of the judiciary. The courts can enforce the Constitution against the rulers With gratitude, Madison took on board Jefferson's suggestion, and he made it an important part of his advocacy for the Bill of Rights in the House of Representatives. The judges, he told his fellow congressmen, the judges will consider themselves in a peculiar manner the guardian of these rights. They will be an impenetrable bulwark against every assumption of power in the legislature or the executive. And they will be naturally led to resist every encroachment upon rights expressly stipulated for in the Constitution by the Declaration of Rights. Thanks to Jefferson, Madison had come to appreciate more fully than he had before the potential for good of one feature of the new Constitution, that is to say, that it is a written Constitution, able to serve, like other law, as a basis for judicial decision. The written Constitution, designated supreme law of the land in Article 6 of the Constitution, elevates what had been mere parchment into enforceable law. Madison had not appreciated that fact sufficiently previously. Although he accepted judicial review as a potential safeguard, he was nonetheless not satisfied with it. For one, he had reservations about the institution of judicial review per se, because he believed it to be in violation of the principles of Republican government, that is to say, rule by the people, and a violation of the principle of the separation of equal powers in establishing something like judicial supremacy. Moreover, he did not consider judicial review likely to be fully effective when one considered the true dynamics and source of dangers in republics. As he said in one of his most telling analyses, wherever the real power in government lies, there is the danger of oppression. In our government, the real power lies in the majority of the community, and the invasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended not from acts of government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from the acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of its constituents. As he had argued in Federalist number 10 and elsewhere, republicanism has not solved the problem of tyranny. Since the majority can be tyrannous, indeed, is the chief danger or threat of tyranny in a republic, a device like a Bill of Rights meant to appeal to the majority to hold off oppression imposed by a ruling elite, this would be of no value. Moreover, since the majority was far the strongest political force in a republic, the judiciary would be limited in its ability to stand athwart it and yell stop. So Madison's skepticism about bills of rights was a direct result of his insights into the dynamics of Republican governance. In 1788, he was still of the view he had held in 1787, probably not too much of a surprise one year later, that view that the best check against majority tyranny was the extended republic and its effects on majority formation. In his letter to Jefferson, Madison laid down the maxim that had driven his earlier thinking about majority tyranny. Wherever there is an interest and a power to do wrong, wrong will generally be done, and not less readily by a powerful and interested party than by a powerful and interested prince. There's a very similar thought in Federalist number 10. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. In the Bill of Rights debate, Madison is merely adding to morality and religion a list on paper of protected rights as an inefficacious reliance for preventing majority oppression. And yet, despite his hesitations and doubts about bills of rights, he became the engine that pulled that train up the hill to inclusion in the Constitution. Given his lukewarmness, it would have been extremely easy for him to let the whole thing go in the face of the lack of real interest in Congress. What accounts then for the strength and persistence of his advocacy? There were, I think, two reasons behind his pressure for a Bill of Rights. First off, he became convinced that a Bill of Rights would cement support for the Constitution and overcome lingering doubts and suspicions of the motives of those people, including himself, who had pressed hardest for the Constitution. As he said at the conclusion of his speech advocating the Bill of Rights, it would be highly politic for the tranquility of the public mind and the stability of the government that we should offer something in the form I have proposed to be incorporated in the system of government as a declaration of rights of the people. He was aware that there was much suspicion in the nation that the sponsors of the Constitution were more eager to establish a strong and potentially dangerous government than they were to protect the rights for the sake of which government existed in the first place. So long as such belief persisted, he feared, the people would not be wholeheartedly committed to the new Constitution, even when it was officially ratified. I believe, he said in Congress, that the great mass of the people who opposed the Constitution disliked it because it did not contain effectual provision against the encroachments on particular rights. He expected that the politic adoption of a Bill of Rights would set his countrymen's hearts and minds at rest, and in this he seems to have been correct. Thus, Madison had his politic reasons for persisting in the Bill of Rights project, but more importantly, he came to think differently and more positively about a Bill of Rights. What accounts for that change? In his congressional speech, Madison begins with the same basic analysis as in his letter to Jefferson. The prescriptions, he said, in favor of liberty want to be leveled against the quarter where the greatest danger lies, namely that which possesses the highest powers. But this is not to be found in either the executive or the legislative, but in the great body of the people operating by the majority against the minority. Earlier, Madison thought that this fact rendered bills of rights superfluous, but now, recognizing the dominance of the people became a reason to have a Bill of Rights. It may be thought, he said, that all paper barriers against the power of the community are too weak to be worthy of attention. He did not say so in this context. Madison had been foremost among those who had had that very thought. He concedes that declarations of rights may have less power than some might wish, but he now sees that these declarations have, as he put it, such a tendency to impress some degree of respect for them, to establish the public opinion in their favor and rouse attention of the whole community. And having such a tendency, bills of rights may be one means to control the majority from those acts to which they might otherwise be inclined. The Bill of Rights in a republic is not, Madison now sees, a means to appeal to the people against an oppressive master, but rather a means to educate the people not to be an oppressive master. Why should Madison think that bills of rights can fulfill this role when in his letter to Jefferson, he had been rather more impressed with how little they succeed in curbing majorities? The answer lies, I think, in pondering the situation that he was facing. He was feeling the need to press for a Bill of Rights in large part because the people wanted one. They showed themselves to be attached to the idea of special protection for their rights. Declarations of rights mean something to the people. They pay attention to them. Though bills of rights are not perfect, such declarations do rouse the attention of the whole community, and thus, as educators of the people, can have some impact. Madison came to realize that since republicanism means that political power rests in the hands of the people, some effort must be made to train the people to use their power rightly and wisely. Of course, just as committed as he was to the Republican principle, meaning majority rule, he was equally wary of the tendency of republics to produce tyrannous majorities. He proposed a number of institutional solutions to this problem, the most trusted of which was the idea of the extended republic. This device, he thought, would encourage the formation of non-tyrannical majorities. He came to see that a Bill of Rights could contribute to that same end if republicanism means government by the great body of the people. Why should the people not be formed in a way to respect their rights, the rule that their rule should secure? Why not take more seriously the idea of the people's rule and work to shape the people into a body fit to rule? An explicit declaration of rights enshrined in the Constitution and enforceable by law could have an impact on the opinions of the people. A consensus formed around the protections of the Bill of Rights is possible because the rights protected are almost universally demanded by all citizens for themselves and can be easily accepted as due to others as well. The people's interest in the protection of their rights differs from their other interests in that their rights interests are not zero-sum. All can enjoy the rights protections without diminishing the rights protections of others. This is normally not so with economic interests, as implicated, for example, in tax or tariff policies. Declared rights can become, I should say, a political principle that the people take as a first principle of their political belief and action, as indeed has largely occurred with regard to the main principles of the Bill of Rights. We're living through this right now with the whole business about Twitter and Elon Musk, interestingly, and we see how the force of the First Amendment's thoughts on free speech have continuing force in our society. Is there a moral to this story of the almost accidental origin of the Bill of Rights? I think there are two. One has to do with Madison and one with the Bill of Rights itself. As one scholar well said, a healthy controversy exists over whether Madison's policy positions remained consistent throughout his career. Shortly after the Constitution was enacted, Madison seemed to change course from an ardent nationalist, predominantly concerned with tyranny of the majority, to an outspoken localist fearing the abuses of a particular minority. Such a reversal in his politics, if true, would call into question the consistency of his political thought, and, this scholar said, challenges his role as our guide to the Constitution and the theoretical foundations of the American political system. The Bill of Rights, I would say, is an obvious place where we can see Madison apparently changing his mind. But in this case, at least, we can also see that this change had more the character of his coming to accept or supplement the Bill of Rights as educator of the people, to his fear of majority tyranny and his reliance on the institutional device of the large republic. This is a change, but it's not a major change. This is a moral, perhaps of most interest to scholars. A broader interest is the moral about the Bill of Rights itself. The protection of our basic rights, Madison came to see, depends not only on clever political structures, nor on the Supreme Court, but on us. We the people, must hold these rights in our hearts and minds. We must assert ourselves in their defense. But Madison's point goes further. These rights are not merely matters for self-assertion and self-defense, but even more for self-restraint. They are not only means to appeal to the people against oppressive masters, but even more a means to educate the people not to be an oppressive master. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's an excellent talk. We'll transition to the panel now. Just give us one moment. Bill will come up. We do hope ardently for questions from the audience, but before we get to that, I would like to let our two panelists say a bit of, offer some reflections on James Madison, offer Professor Zuckert a chance to say a few more thoughts and open up to discussion from those of you who are in the audience. Let me introduce our panelists. I think I can say without fear of contradiction that our first panelist, needs no introduction. I just did that a few minutes ago. So I'll instead introduce Michael briefly, and then Bill Allen. William B. Allen, in the center of the panel, is Emeritus Professor of Political Philosophy in the Department of Political Science and Emeritus Dean, James Madison College at Michigan State University. In 2018 to 2020, he was a senior scholar in residence in the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Chicago. He served previously on the United States National Council for the Humanities as chairman and member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights as executive director of the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia, and as chief operating officer at the Center for Urban Renewal and Education in Washington, D.C. He has published extensively on American political thought and political philosophy, including Rethinking Uncle Tom, the Political Philosophy of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and George Washington, America's First Progressive, as well as being a well-known scholar of James Madison. Next to Professor Allen, we have Alan Gibson, who is a senior fellow at the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri. He earned his PhD at the University of Notre Dame. His focus is on American political thought, especially that of the American founding. Alan has had fellowships from the International Center for Jefferson Studies in Charlottesville, Virginia, the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He has published articles in, among other journals, American Political Thought, Polity, History of Political Thought, and the Review of Politics. He is the author of 2 books on the historiography of the American founding, both published by University Press of Kansas. And he is currently researching several aspects of the political thought of James Madison. So let's welcome the whole panel. Who wants to start?
All right. Okay. So I don't disagree with very much of what Michael Zuckert said in that story. In fact, over the years, I've learned an awful lot about what I know about James Madison from Michael Zuckert. It's kind of disingenuous for me to expand on things that aren't really very major disagreements, and I don't want to go there. It just isn't necessary. They're mostly technical and matters of emphasis, any disagreements I have with him. I would say that I would emphasize foundationally, and Michael emphasized this, but I want to even make it even more emphatically. Madison was the leading civil libertarian of his generation, I think. He was the person, I believe, most committed to the protection of individual rights, especially freedom of press and freedom of religion, which was known as freedom of conscience or liberty of conscience in the 18th century. It was an embracing idea that included religious liberty, the practice of religious liberty, what we now call free exercise, but also the idea of separation of church and state was embedded in that as well. Madison had a history of protecting these rights both before and after the Bill of Rights controversy. In the state of Virginia, he fought against a bill that would have raised a tax on general citizens in order to supply it to religious groups for the support of ministers, actually, of their choosing. He opposed that vehemently. He worked hard to keep that from taking place because he just didn't believe that government should be involved in matters of religious conscience. He just thought that they would screw it up and that they were more likely to violate liberty if they introduced themselves into questions of religious liberty. So, again, the foundational consistency of James Madison is toward the protection of those rights, and that becomes evident too with liberty of the press. He becomes one of the leading opponents of the Alien and Sedition Acts and of restrictions against civil liberties during the 1790s. And he develops a conception of liberty of the press, which is, I think, quite modern and quite prescient, and is quite admirable. It's one of the more interesting accomplishments he makes. I think Michael touched on this in his first sort of lesson of the story he told, but I also want to say, again, I think sharpening in my understanding of what Michael was saying, one of the things that Madison brings to this debate is that he has a much more complex understanding of how rights are protected than most Americans have today. So Michael mentioned Jefferson's intervention in the Bill of Rights controversy, where Jefferson comes in and he says, Madison, you haven't thought about how writing these protections for rights on paper will make the judiciary involved. They will have a legal status. The judiciary can then check the power of the legislative body to make laws that govern these issues. That's the Jefferson understanding of this is sort of how Americans have come over a long period of time to understand how rights are protected. How are your rights protected? Well, if the government violates them, you go to the judiciary, and the judiciary strikes down the law that was passed. All of the things that Michael was talking about in a nuanced way about what Madison is saying with regard to this point to the importance of convention generally, the education of people, their acceptance of the responsibility for protecting those rights themselves, their own understanding of that liberty, but also norms about governance that reach out to public officials in particular. So our protection for our rights depends upon electing legislators who see that it is no part of the power of their office to engage in the bill in the first place. So the First Amendment to the Constitution reads, Congress shall make no law. And this means it's not within the authority of Congress to make a law about these particular things. Religious liberty, freedom of the press. They just don't have the authority. It's not in their jurisdiction to do this. Well, they have to accept that responsibility and understand that responsibility. And Madison was saying that, it seems to me, as well. But among the people in general, he is saying to them, you have to not allow other people to violate rights. If they come to you and they want to form what he would call a majority faction, and that majority faction is in favor of something that violates the individual rights of someone, don't join the faction, okay? Resist it. Don't join with your contemporaries in an act of majority tyranny. If the government, through an independent act, does this and the judiciary doesn't check it, they violate someone's rights, then join with other people against the government. So part of Madison's consistency can be traced to the kind of bifurcated understanding he has of the possibilities of violations of liberty. On the one hand, he believes that the people can be sources of violations of liberty through majority factionalism. On the other, independent acts of the government. You do something different in both times. He has a developed understanding of both of those types of violations of liberty, even at the time of the Constitutional Convention, even though he's emphasizing one of them over another of them. And then in the 1790s, he comes to a particular circumstance in which it's the government acting independently that is the primary violator of rights in this case. So what do? You rouse what he calls a defensive concert of the people. People have to join together and take responsibility for defending their own liberty against these acts of government. So I read Madison as having a much more sophisticated understanding of the sources of liberty and how liberty is protected than we normally take from the story of the Bill of Rights. And Michael was definitely, I think he basically said that, but I'm trying just to reinforce it there. Just to add a little bit to the story, you can't cover the whole story of the Bill of Rights in one 40-minute speech and so presentation. I just want to talk about the 3 amendments that Madison proposed that were not passed, and that's really interesting as well, it seems to me. So when Madison wrote out the list of rights that he was going to protect in the Bill of Rights, he developed 12 different amendments that that eventually were proposed in the House of Representatives to Congress. The first of these was actually one that systematically added representatives based upon increases in population. So when the population grew, the number of representatives in the House of Representatives was also going, to grow with it. And he set out a patterned increase in this, okay? This was not passed. It actually, that was proposed to the states. It was never ratified. But it addresses a really interesting contemporary problem. So under the Constitution, you cannot have more than one representative for every 30,000 Americans. We have 435 representatives, and now we have, 340 million Americans. So we don't have to worry about the 30,000 barrier. We don't have anywhere near the number of representatives. I forgot to do the math. I should do the math on how many we would have if we had one for every 30,000. It's something like that at the formation of the Constitution. There were 65 representatives in the House of Representatives under the original Constitution. Madison's systematic increase eventually would have stabilized at a certain number, and we would have faced the same problem we do now. But now we have roughly one representative for every 730 or 740,000 Americans. This poses a really difficult problem of constitutional design, because on the one hand, I tell my students, you're going to live long enough, I probably won't, but you're going to live long enough for where there are 435 million Americans. That you may see that. So you may live to the point where there's one representative in the House of Representatives for every million Americans. Is that enough representation? So that's one part of the problem. But if you add representatives to a legislative body, and Madison is an astute analyst of this as well, you may change the dynamics of that legislative body. At the point in which you start to add more and more and more and more representatives, you can actually, this is Madison's theory about this, create a more concentrated decision-making process than you meant to. Something done in order to serve the interest of liberty and greater representation may throw the decision-making power in the body that's designed to do that back on fewer individuals. It's very hard to get to speak in the House of Representatives right now, and it's controlled by the Speaker of the House, who gets on the agenda. In contrast, in the Senate, which has only 100 members, the right to speak freely is to have your say on any bill is sort of just guaranteed. It's a convention. It's a rule of the body. And in order to stop somebody from speaking, you have to do something called evoking cloture. That's how you end a filibuster. But anyway, those are technical points. But at any rate, you have this one body where you can speak all you want because it's very small. The other one, you have to have a great deal of authorization in order to do this. And this is because of the size of the body. The only point of mentioning all of this is that we're sort of caught on the horns of the dilemma with regard to this. Other legislative bodies across the world do have far more members than 435. So we may want to think that we are going to increase this, the number in Congress. I actually believe we should do that systematically. But of course, right now is not the time to do any kind of reform in this age of polarization. Any addition of any representative is going to be fought tooth and nail, and any amendment is going to pass because it would not have the necessary number. A couple more of these. Madison also proposed, and this was Madison's only exception to Michael's observations about his aversion to structural amendments. So Madison doesn't want the anti-federalist understanding of amendments to take hold in the House of Representatives. He doesn't want these members of the House to be able to reform the Constitution. He knows how hard it was to get the document that they got, which was by no means the Constitution he wanted completely, by any means, out of that body. He knows how much he sacrificed to do it. He knows how hard he worked to have it happen. He doesn't want the whole thing thrown up in the air again through a second constitutional convention or through structural amendments to the Constitution in the House of Representatives. So he wants to keep that from happening. At the same time, though, he proposes in Congress an amendment that says that no state government shall violate the freedom of the press, liberty of conscience, or trial by jury. Okay, so he is actually looking forward to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. He's looking back to a universal veto of state laws that he proposed at the Constitutional Convention, but he's looking forward to what is called the incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the state governments that's going to take place over a long period of time and in a very unsystematic way across American constitutional history in the 20th century. So he would have preempted that, not for every right in the Bill of Rights, but for what he believed were foundational ones. It's a really important and interesting thing. Really quickly, also, he proposes an amendment which is known euphemistically as the Rip Van Winkle Amendment to the Constitution. It's really, there's just a fascinating story behind this amendment. So one of his proposals is that representatives not be able to increase their own pay during the session in which they are in that body, okay? Madison, as an ethical observation, believes that no person should be a judge in their own cause. If you're a judge in your own cause, you corrupt yourself. You're biased naturally, and you become corrupted by serving as a judge in your own cause. So what he's saying here is no representative should be a judge in their own cause with regard to their pay. So you can vote forward a pay raise under this amendment in the next session, where you don't necessarily know that you're going to be the person inhabiting that seat. So you have to do it systematically. Well, that amendment to the Constitution also falters in ratification in the states. It doesn't get passed, but then it gets revived in the 1970s through the actions of one individual. It's a young man. He has proposed this in a paper he wrote in an honors class, I don't think it's an honors class actually, in a class, an American government class at the University of Texas at Austin. He has written a paper about it, and he says, you know, this is a really good idea. He is caught up in this, in the sympathy and opposition to politicians during this time period. Congress is at record low levels of popularity during this time period. He sees all this and he says, this is a good idea. They keep voting themselves pay raises and they shouldn't be able to do that until they perform their job better. And they should have to face the consequences of it at an election if they do it, but they shouldn't be able to do it in the first place. So he resurrects James Madison's proposal that you have to have an intervening session. He starts writing state legislatures. He spends his nights. He's taken a job about that time. He spends his nights writing to different state legislatures. The thing takes off. And then conservative leaders in the country come behind his proposal, and they actually try to take credit for it and eliminate this person. I can't believe, I don't remember the guy's name. You may remember his name specifically. Anyway, and they try to take credit for what he's doing, and it just takes off. And this constitutional amendment becomes the 27th amendment to the Constitution, most recently ratified amendment to the Constitution. And again, it's sometimes called the Rip Van Winkle Amendment because the individual woke it up. And it's a very interesting story in a lot of different ways, some much more complex than I'm suggesting. And it raises all kinds of questions about whether an amendment that's been passed by a number of states you have to have ratification immediately of all of the states, or you can go over 200 years later and still have, or close to 200 years later, and still have that ratification of that amendment count. Okay, so the original states that ratified the amendment were considered as having still ratified that amendment when it came back to Congress in the 1970s. It was very interesting to see talk of ERA coming back on board recently, the Equal Rights Amendment, And the question was going to be, well, what about those states that ratified the Equal Rights Amendment previously in the 1960s, I guess, 1970s? What was their status going to be? If the court had said, or if anybody had said, well, you have to start completely over again, then the example of the 27th Amendment to the Constitution would have been immediately evoked and said, well, it didn't have to happen here, so why does it have to happen here? Anyway, there's some really complex and interesting constitutional questions that arise from that. And that's mine.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to be here in honor of Professor Kirwan and Mrs. Kirwan. My colleagues and I share many things in common, not the least of which is association with James Madison in various roles and endeavors. I, of course, was introduced to you as a former dean of James Madison College, at which they've all presented. We've all shared the title of James Madison Fellow, if I remember correctly, at Princeton University. You have not? Or you have?
Yes, sir.
We have largely shared that title. In other words, it's been a cottage industry for us. This James Madison, we've written books on James Madison, talked about the issues raised by James Madison, and now they've been presented before us this morning. I should say, among the things that I've done, which was not mentioned, was to have published earlier a book entitled Let the Advice Be Good, a defense of James Madison's democratic nationalism. And my comment this morning, briefly in response to Michael's presentation, is to reaffirm that James Madison is a democratic nationalist, but then to say a few words about what that might mean, particularly in the context of what has been presented. I would begin by making the observation that James Madison is incontestably the father of the Bill of Rights, though more contestably the father of the Constitution. And even though he's incontestably the father of the Bill of Rights, his DNA is not the exclusive DNA that can be traced through the Bill of Rights. So that understanding the relationship of Madison to the heritage that we have requires understanding all of the elements that went into shaping it, including those that Madison influenced and those by which Madison was influenced, which weren't always compatibly with Madison's goals and objectives. The broader question of Madison's consistency I have always treated as one that has a relatively shallow depth to it, not from the point of view of the intellectual contributions of those who talk about it, because they are profound, but from the point of view that none of us are ever consistent as human beings over the course of life. We make this journey from the beginning to the end, often being presented with occasion to change. Madison no less than we, and Madison greeted that occasion no less amiably than we do. So to insist upon our consistency is an unrealistic standard to raise for anyone in anything. Therefore, does it matter whether James Madison was consistent or not? What matters is whether at any given point he makes a compelling argument. And we've seen Michael Zuckert offer several examples of such compelling arguments in his account this morning. So I just want to give some nuance in thinking about this and run quickly through some of the observations that we're looking at, and then add a few others that may aid us in thinking about this. And one of the ones that I want to begin with is the whole notion of what a Bill of Rights is. Madison spoke about this quite eloquently at great length and with frequency. And one of the things we tend to forget is that there was a tradition at the time for bills of right. They existed in all the state constitutions practically, with rare exceptions. And they had a certain form. And they all began with lengthy preambular statements that were more hortatory in form than legalistic in form, but serving to remind the people of the copiousness of their authority and power. And we know, of course, that what we know is the Bill of Rights has no such preamble. What we may not remember is that there was an intensive debate in 1789 in the Congress after these were introduced as to whether it should have some preambular elaboration. Madison resisted that. Why did Madison resist that? Because it was thought that those had been the source of mischief in the state governments that had it, and that the state government performance, which Madison so much lamented, was as much connected with the way in which bills of rights were received in the states as with the constitutional structures in the states. So there were many dangers to be averted. And among those dangers would be to raise false expectations through preambular statements. One of the arguments in the debate in 1789 was we already have a preamble to the Constitution and it's sufficient. And we don't want to have a rival to it as the preamble to the Bill of Rights. There was something more important. Madison didn't propose a Bill of Rights. I want you to hear that. He proposed integrating into the text of the Constitution specific exceptions to the powers granted. He didn't want this caudal appendage added at the end of the Constitution. And he thought that was a danger. He lost that battle. He lost it to the manful and insistent performance of Mr. Sherman from Connecticut, who would not yield. He said the Constitution is sacred and you can't tamper with it. You can only add something to it as an appendix, and prevailed in the end. Now, why was that important from Madison's perspective? Why would he have preferred only to read into the existing text specific exceptions? Part of the answer lies in the content of some of the provisions of the Bill of Rights, particularly those two that produced the 9th and 10th Amendment that Michael referred us to. Those produced some of the longest debates, apart from the debate over whether to add it at the end or make it an insertion. They produced the longest debates precisely because there was confusion as to what they accomplished. And it was Madison who sought to clear that up by arguing in August debating on the Bill of Rights as they had reached their mature form coming out of the Committee of the Whole, that there are implied powers in government. And we need these in order to curtail those implied powers. In every government, Madison said, that was his expression, in every government there are implied powers. Now, Madison is the great warrior against implied powers, as we know from the 1790s. And so the Madison who makes the theoretical statement that in every government there are implied powers, and the practical politician who resists implied powers under the Constitution in the 1790s, are not inconsistent with one another. It is simply the one, the practical politician, who deals with the reality of what the nature of government is about. And therefore says every government has implied powers. Therefore, as Alan points out, we must do something to try to keep those under control. We must invoke, well, let's call it, if we will, the power of populism, nationalist populism somehow. And that's an appeal to the conscience, appeal to the opinion of the people. Or the way I would put it, going back to Michael's account of why Madison introduced the Bill of Rights in the first place, he wanted to invoke what I would call a mindful populism. A populism informed by certain kinds of principles. And we can trace the genealogy of that as well, because we know that Madison collaborated with George Washington in producing the first inaugural address that was actually delivered, and that address set the agenda for the Congress, and prominent in that agenda was to pass a Bill of Rights. Why? Precisely to conciliate opinion in the community. So that to produce a mindful populism was an important thing. Now that's a practical goal. It's not a theoretical goal. It's not primarily a moral goal. It's a practical goal. Why is it a practical goal? Because Republican government reposes upon the sustained support of the people, the opinion of the people. And if it doesn't begin by fostering that support, it is not likely to improve in that relationship over time. And so Madison and Washington both were subscribed to this principle that we must initiate those primary efforts to build public support by satisfying the public expectation for a Bill of Rights. But does that mean that the content is determined? No. Alan has pointed out, one of the things Madison wanted to do was to limit the state governments, not just the federal government. He wanted the Bill of Rights to impose restrictions on the exercise of power in the states. That was the thing about which he had most complained prior to the drafting of the Constitution, when he wrote the essays on the vices of the political system in the United States. The great source of vice was in state government. Madison wasn't inconsistent. He didn't change just because later in his career he was resisting the federal government. No. At each stage, he aimed his arsenal of weapons against what he perceived as the pending danger to the public order. And those dangers change over time. Accordingly, responses must change over time. So that the James Madison we're talking about is the James Madison who played pivotal roles, often right, often wrong. We can't forget that in these debates over the Constitution. It was Madison who inserted in the Constitutional Convention, when there was at a moment of great tension over the question of representation, the question of slavery, in an attempt to try to shake loose that small state alliance which had brought slave and non-slave states together and looking to separate them. He was willing to play tough politics throughout his career, and sometimes erroneously. It was he who fulfilled the pledge of the Constitution to eliminate the foreign slave trade, but did it in a way that was not very thoughtful in 1807, 1808, because it immediately surfaced the question of race, which he was not prepared to address, and set off huge controversies in the country. Something that he never actually came to terms with in a manner that could project a future for the United States, and pretty much had to lead to the course of events. So as we look at James Madison, his contributions to the founding, we have to play this very careful game of analysis in which we see how he has been pivotal. He's been there at the critical moments, starting with introducing the central importance of the freedom of conscience, which goes beyond, by the way, just the defense of liberty and the Bill of Rights. It's something more important than that. When Madison in the Memorial and Remonstrance in 1785 begins by saying, human beings have an obligation to God before any obligation to civil society. And that's what the freedom of conscience means. That's not protected by a parchment barrier or anything institutional or anything else. It's only protected, as Alan said, by the resolve of individuals to abide by the commands of conscience at all costs. Now, that means that Madison was pivotal in setting the tone for the United States through that Memorial and Remonstrance in Virginia in a way that set the character for the nation, even if it didn't set the institutional framework. And that's where I want to conclude. The nation has a character, and it has an institutional or legal framework. There's going to be a great deal more variability in dealing with the legal framework than there is permissible variability in dealing with the character. If the commitment to the freedom of conscience wavers, it doesn't matter what the institutions provide for. No. Judicial review, Bill of Rights, separation of powers, checks and balances, all of it loses its value if the freedom of conscience loses its priority in the souls of the citizens of the Republic. So that we are able to say that we can look back to Madison as giving us a perspective, a point of focus, which is salvific in its influence, independently of the changing vagaries of our institutional and legal performance. We can go from attacking judicial review to defending judicial review, depending on the season. And we know that Madison is still on both sides of that question as well. But the important thing is not whether he was consistent, but whether he gave us critical components of what constitutes the real shape of the United States.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to?
Well, I would just want, I'd like to maybe, I think, clarify one point that Bill made. Otherwise, I'd just like to throw it open to the audience. It seemed to me, Bill, you identified Madison as a great warrior against the implied powers. I think that it'd be better to say a great warrior against a certain interpretation of implied powers and a supporter of other interpretations. That is, he opposed the Hamiltonian very broad interpretation, but he did favor a more narrow interpretation. So we don't want to give the impression that he was straitjacketing the government when he had said quite otherwise, that he's quite consistent in saying all governments have to have implied powers. He never, I think, backed away from that. Otherwise, nothing to add.
I just want to say two really quick things to respond to Bill too before we open it up. And the first of those is that we think of inconsistency as inconsistency in character, as instrumental, utilitarian, abolition of our own principled consistency. We think of consistency in terms of a principle. Consistency can also mean the unwillingness to learn, okay, and adapt. And so I see Madison as learning and adapting. With regard to the Bill of Rights, either all together in the front of the, as an appendage to the text, or inserting the amendments in the Constitution, that's a really interesting formulation, because I think one of the things that Madison we would have benefited from putting them in the text of the Constitution has to do with interpretation. Everyone knows that interpretation depends upon language that surrounds words. If we had Congress and make no law inserted into part of Article 1, where it would have been a very different interpretive practice in some ways. I think it could have been it's an interesting experience. But at any rate, when you insert them in the text, you think of them as amendments. And when you put them together as an appendage, then the possibility, but only the possibility, arises to think of them as a Bill of Rights. Madison called his project collectively Protections for the Sacred Rights of Mankind. That's how he referred to it. But phraseology of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, even after they're ratified in 1790 and 1791, doesn't solidify for a long time. We don't call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution the Bill of Rights until really the 19th century. They're not thought of collectively in that way. And so that's an interesting proposition.
Thank you.
Let me just add a quick note.
All right.
If we go to the ratification announcements from the states, we will see that they look at it as a Bill of Rights from the beginning. And I will also add that it's important to remember the language. The First Amendment, as first drafted by Madison, was there shall be no national religion established. That's very different from what we know as the First Amendment to the Constitution. So the debate surrounding that's what's critical to establishing the meaning of it. They do not have any kind of permanently etched sense that we can grasp unless we go back and see why it was that Congress resisted that formulation, which actually conveyed powers they never intended to convey.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Joshua?
Please correct me if my assumptions are wrong on this, but it's definitely a question for all three. Could you speculate as to the Supreme Court's lack of decisive use and interpretation or application of the Ninth Amendment, specifically as such as it wasn't even utilized until the 20th century, that the Supreme Court utilized any aspect of the Ninth Amendment in a ruling? Even then, it was only in a supporting manner, primarily to the 14th.
Is this addressed to me?
All of you.
All of us? Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting questions is, did Madison consider the Ninth Amendment to be justiciable? My own impression is that he did not. That is to say, it was part of the educative part of the Bill of Rights. That is, you're going to teach the people and their legislators that there are rights other than those that have been listed. But he himself was very, as I said in my talk, he was not a great supporter of judicial review. He had a very paradoxical view about judicial review. On the one hand, he thought it was a power that had been granted to the courts in the Constitution. That he believed, that it was a power the courts legitimately exercised, but he thought it was a power that was wrong for them to have. So he was not, and so when usable, he thought it should be used. But on the whole, he was not a big supporter of a big, expansive judiciary. And the Ninth Amendment is an invitation for a big, expansive judiciary. And I think he would have thought, no, this doesn't give enough legal guidance to a court to make such decisions. So this has been, I don't know if you're familiar with there's a fellow named Randy Barnett, who's a law professor, who's been promoting over all his life the Ninth Amendment as what courts should rehabilitate the Ninth Amendment. And almost all of my life, I've opposed him on that. So that's at least, that's my take on it, that some of the other amendments would be justiciable, but not the Ninth.
I'll just say briefly, I'm going to be delivering a lecture for the Florida Department of Education in the coming 10 days on the 10th Amendment, which necessarily means on the 9th Amendment. And the burden of that lecture is going to be to show, in light of Thornton and Prince's recent jurisprudence, that the 9th Amendment's meaning has to be captured within the context of the 10th Amendment, which ends, of course, with the reference "or to the people." And taking the reference to the people of the 9th and the reference to the people of the 10th is the only way to come, it seems to be, to a coherent understanding of what is intended by the Constitution.
Is there any way that lecture will be digitally available?
It is going to be digitally available to Florida teachers in the school children. I imagine they might be able to make it available elsewhere. I will inquire into that if you'll be in touch with me.
Great, appreciate that, yeah, truly, thank you.
Other questions from the, or,
Well, the only judicial salience I know of the Ninth Amendment comes in Griswold itself, which is the case that, in which the right to privacy is constructed, and then that expands, of course, and is such a disputed thing. I actually disagree with Bill, and I think the 9th and 10th Amendment are very distinct entities. I'll be interested in the lecture.
okay, good. Rhonda, go ahead.
So, Professor Zuckert, I wanted to pose this to you. Reading about the ratifying conventions, at least I think from Madison's perspective, it was like a suspense thriller. Is the state going to ratify, how many votes, the whole business. And to get that ultimate ratification from the states, I think it was maybe, I don't know whether it was New York or Virginia, but he gave his word that there would be a Bill of Rights. Am I correct in that?
Mhm.
So I guess I wonder if the reason he didn't change course so much that he just gave his word. He promised that he would do it, and he did it. Even when people weren't as interested in Congress, he still gave his word, and it was about character.
Well, I mean, all he could, I mean, I think that was, in fact, I think that was important in his action. I think in general, Madison was a great believer in that what we gave our word to counted and that we should stick to it. So, no, I mean, I wouldn't deny that. On the other hand, all he could give his word to actually is, I'm going to make whatever effort I can to get a Bill of Rights. And if Congress was just not interested, he could say, oh, I did what I could do, and that was good enough. So I think what I was trying to bring out is what beyond that, beyond his word, might have driven Madison to be, more persistent. But I mean, that doesn't mean his word meant nothing. I think it did mean something. But I think there was, as I tried to say, I think there was a shift in his way of thinking about the relation between the government and the people that did occur between the original Constitution making and the time of the Bill of Rights. And so, so it's it's like a lot of stories in history. There's no unicausal force.
Yeah, he just seemed to have this way of having a problem before him. How am I going to argue this? Going from state to state or individual to individual. And he was brilliant in how he formulated his counter arguments.
He was fantastic. Yeah, he was. But I think also I still would say he had an underlying political analysis. I mean, it isn't just ad hoc rhetoric needed for some occasion. He had very clear analytic principles of how republicanism should work. And I think if I had to identify the legacy of Madison, it would really be that he is the person who thought out what Republican governance actually involved, way beyond, I think, way beyond where others of his peers were at that time, and that we as a country owe a lot to his individual brilliance in this matter.
Thank you.
He writes a letter to George Eve, who is an evangelical preacher, saying that he is bound by honor to pursue a Bill of Rights. I know Michael wasn't taking that motivation out of consideration at all, but he's very explicit in that motivation, in acknowledging that motivation. And it's particularly important to evangelical Christians in Virginia that he followed through with an amendment that protects religious liberty for them because they've been persecuted. Madison's earliest commitment to religious liberty came from viewing the persecution of Virginia Baptists in particular, who he thinks that this is a really, really bad thing that my state is doing, and we got to protect them. And that's part of what he's doing in Memorial and Remonstrance and in the church-state struggle in 1785 and 1786. He develops a special affinity for that group of people. They look to him, he looks to them, even though this is called a symbiotic relationship, that he has with them, because he's an Enlightenment philosopher, they're Virginia evangelicals, and they join, nevertheless, in this kind of alliance to get protection for religious liberty.
Please, go ahead.
Could you repeat what type of philosopher you said he was?
I think I said Enlightenment,
An
didn't I?
Enlightenment philosopher. Okay,
Yes.
which brought me to my question if he had religious beliefs. This is kind of an introduction course for me. So, and what those beliefs were and how they came across in his writings.
Well, the thing that Bill pointed out about Memorial and Remonstrance, first paragraph, is a number of statements about the derivation of rights and their relationship to a creator. I think throughout his career, he basically takes out of view, when he's editing his papers late in his life, almost every aspect of his private life. He eliminates it. He X's out or throws the things away or burns them. He does, and he says in an autobiography he writes that all my life has been a public life. If you want to understand me through my public service and my public papers. And so he leaves us with really very few clues on understanding what his personal religious beliefs were. And he deliberately does that.
Drew, go ahead.
So, given that the Madison viewed his parchment barriers as not totally effective, do we view anything else as more substantially effective? That's the big question that's been going around in my mind. If he thought they were, not sufficient, what did he think was sufficient?
Well, Madison, in the lead up to the Constitution, he came up with this analysis of which he was very proud, which is to say that the extended republic, meaning a large republic, very diverse in its character, would be a better safeguard for rights than parchment barriers, than listing rights, or then, at least at that point, he thought then the moral restraint of the people or religious restraint. He had, as he said, when those kind of restraints came up against interest, they tended to wither, and especially for groups of people rather than individuals. So the short answer is the extended republic was his hope. That is to say, the extended republic would operate in various ways, but one of the ways it would operate would be to hamper the formation and the ability to act of unjust majorities which were threats to the rights of others. And so that was his main attempt. I think, at least as I read him, as I interpreted him, I think he came at the time of the Bill of Rights and after to see as a supplement to the extended republic, this attempt to shape the character of the majorities in the country rather than simply to depend on the mechanism, so to speak, of the extended republic and the pluralism in the society to produce decent majorities.
So in that sense, it's almost more aspirational.
Yes, so the second position is more aspirational, and it has to do with, for example, his involvement with the Republican Party that he and Jefferson founded, which seemed to go against the idea of Federalist, of the Federalist tent. He seemed very hostile to parties. He becomes a little friendlier to them later on. Yeah, and more, I'd say in general, friendlier to aspirationalism than he had been earlier. He was very hard-headed, very reason of state sort of thinking in the earlier part. I think he becomes a little softer in his later years.
There's time for one more question, I think. I'm going to go. Somebody got to talk. Go ahead, please.
This This question goes along a little bit with some previous questions, but I just wondered, do you have any insight about any of the early influences that Madison had that helped shape his ethical perspectives?
The early influences in his life, you mean?
Early influences in his life.
Well, I think we probably all have some sense of that. I have recently given a broad overview for an encyclopedia entry in which I explained what his early education was like, his tutors, his time at Princeton, particularly his relationship with his very dear friend, William Bradford. And that was a phase of his life in which I would say we perhaps saw a great deal of ethical formation taking place. And at that point, it was colored a great deal by a kind of poetic sympathy. This is the way I would put it. It brought out this commitment to rights that Alan is talking about, or sensitivity, I would say, rather than commitment in this particular phase. But I think that he was always someone who, almost in the tradition of the Scottish Enlightenment, who reflected rather deeply on the dimensions of human sentiment, and therefore tried to find a space within that realm of reflection to shape his attitudes. But I don't remember him ever pointing to an authority before which he prostrated himself, other than in such things as the memorial and remonstrance, indicating what the general human situation was with respect to divine authority.
The sources of his political thought is one of the biggest debates that people like, there's a whole cottage industry in that, trust me, about whether the Scottish Enlightenment, Lockean liberalism, Protestant Christianity, where were they drawing their political thought for? I realized that you pointed to his ethical thinking more than his political thinking. And so, I mean, John Witherspoon is another person who needs to be put on the table. He's Madison's mentor at Princeton. He studies under Witherspoon. At that time, I don't know if there were 2 or 3 professors at Princeton, what was the College of New Jersey. And so he would have had that association with only a few individuals. Witherspoon has a reading list. We have published his lectures on government, on moral philosophy, and things like that. And you can find many sources in that. Again, this is a really broad debate. I will just say that there's an interesting kind of Calvinistic kind of strain in Madison's thought in terms of this a certain degree of realism. This is one of the reasons I really like him. He has he's skeptical of individuals judging their own cause. He's skeptical of groups judging their own cause. He's skeptical of a lot of different things. At the same time, he's committed to Republican government, which he believes is the form of government that takes the highest view of human nature. So he brings those two things into tension with each other, and it's one of the sources of what is, in my estimation, the most creative mind in the American family.
I would like to dissent a little bit from my colleagues. I would distinguish his ethical from his political. I think Locke was the biggest influence on his political thinking, but Montesquieu, the French philosopher, was also a very important source for him, and we shouldn't leave him out. Where I would dissent from what Ellen and Bill said is with regard to the Scottish Enlightenment. We know that his education was indeed in the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, and that Witherspoon, his main teacher, was a partisan of the Scottish Enlightenment. But the Scottish Enlightenment had, I would call it, a optimistic view of human morality. That is, they wanted to say there was a kind of innate moral sense that we have that allows human beings to recognize and act more or less morally. Madison, especially in his constitutional phase, was much more dubious about that. I quoted to you his statement, when interest is on one side and morality and religion on the other, count on interest to win. That's a view not really a characteristic of Scottish Enlightenment moral philosophy. I would say with regard to morality, the moral issues, one thinker who did influence him was David Hume, who was connected to the Scottish Enlightenment, or thinkers, but was a more skeptical thinker with regard to morality and other matters. Hume, for example, put forward a principle that I think Madison acted on, which was, in reality, not all human beings are scoundrels, but in politics, we must expect that they will be.
Permit me just to say, I would not disagreeing at all about this general characterization of the situation of humankind. I am always mindful that we need to be careful not to take those general descriptions of humanity as private confessions.
Very good. All right, thank you. That's the last word.